The cargo containers were still being loaded at Kaohsiung port when the first alert reached Taiwan's Joint Operations Command Center. It was 2:51 in the morning. Not a missile warning, not an aircraft intrusion alarm, something quieter and in some ways more terrifying than either of those things. A pattern recognition signal from the American Signals Intelligence Architecture that blankets the Western Pacific. A continuous automated watch that compares today's PLA Navy movement data against every historical baseline it has ever recorded. The pattern it was reading at 2:51 in the morning had no historical baseline, because it had never happened before. In the 70 years since the People's Republic of China first declared Taiwan a renegade province to be reclaimed, through every military exercise, every missile test, every carrier transit, every political crisis that has cycled through the Taiwan Strait and left the world briefly breathless before returning to its permanent, dangerous equilibrium, the PLA had never moved everything at once, until tonight. What unfolded in the next 8 hours was not a war. No shots were fired, no vessels were struck, no pilot punched out over the Taiwan Strait. No government issued a formal declaration of anything. What unfolded in the next 8 hours was something that Beijing's strategic planners had been building toward for a decade, something that America's Pacific commanders had been preparing to counter for a decade, and something that the world's defense ministries are now studying with an intensity reserved for events that rewrite the rules of military competition. It was China's most sophisticated military operation in history against the world's most contested piece of real estate, in the dark. And it ended not with a victory and not with a defeat, but with a decision made in a room in Beijing at the 8-hour mark that tells you more about the real state of Chinese military power than any intelligence report, any satellite image, or any People's Liberation Army parade ever could. We are going to take you inside those 8 hours. We are going to show you what China moved, what America moved, why the operation stopped, and what the stopping tells every government in Asia about the next time. Because there will be a next time. And the only question that matters is whether the alliance that worked this time will still be there when it happens. Stay with us. Before we get into the operational timeline, I need to correct something. Because if you have been watching mainstream media coverage of what happened in the Taiwan Strait, you have been watching the wrong frame. The coverage has focused on scale, on numbers, on the spectacle of the largest PLA Navy mobilization since 1996. What it has not explained is the logic. China did not move everything at once because it decided to invade Taiwan. The operation was not designed to put PLA Marines on the beaches at Tamsui. It was not designed to capture the presidential office building in Taipei. It was not designed to produce the military conquest that China's constitutional documents describe as the ultimate objective of cross-strait policy. It was designed to do something more sophisticated than an invasion, and in the medium term, something more dangerous. It was designed to establish a blockade. And the blockade of Taiwan is China's most powerful non-nuclear coercive instrument, more powerful than any missile strike, more powerful than any cyber operation, more powerful than 3 decades of diplomatic pressure campaigns that have produced exactly nothing in terms of moving Taiwan toward unification. Here is why. Taiwan imports 98% of its energy. Every barrel of oil, every cubic meter of natural gas, every coal shipment that keeps the power grid of a highly industrialized democracy running arrives by sea. Taiwan's semiconductor industry, the industry that manufactures 60% of the world's advanced chips and over 90% of the most sophisticated chips that exist, the chips inside every smartphone, every server, every advanced weapon system, every piece of technology the modern global economy depends on, that industry runs on a continuous sea-delivered supply chain of chemicals, gases, and specialty materials that cannot be stockpiled for more than weeks. Starve the sea lanes, starve Taiwan. Not in a day, not in a week, but within the 90 to 120-day window that Chinese military planners have calculated as the timeline for economic pressure to force a democratically elected government to make choices no democratic government should face. Negotiate under duress, capitulate, or watch your economy collapse while the world debates whether breaking the blockade by force is worth the risk of a direct military confrontation with a nuclear power. That was the operation, not a conquest, a strangling. Now let me show you exactly what moved. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the People's Liberation Army executed a simultaneous multi-axis deployment that its commanders had been rehearsing in one form or another since 2015. From the north, the Shandong Carrier Battle Group, China's second carrier and its first domestically constructed, transited the Miyako Strait between Japan's Okinawa and Miyako Islands and moved to a holding position northeast of Taiwan. China has transited the Miyako Strait before. Those previous transits were announced. This one was not. And the Shandong was not transiting, it was positioning. Its J-15 fighters on deck, its Type 055 destroyer escorts forming the outer ring of an anti-access envelope that covered the northern approaches to Taiwan's airspace. From the south, the Fujian, China's third carrier, its first equipped with electromagnetic catapult systems capable of launching the full range of PLA Navy fixed-wing aircraft at full combat weight, moved northeast from operating areas in the South China Sea. Positioned south of Taiwan, the Fujian's air wing could contest the southern approaches and coordinate with land-based Eastern Theater Command aviation operating from Fujian province airfields directly across the strait. 2 carrier battle groups, one north, one south. The geometry closed every major air approach to Taiwan simultaneously. But the carriers were not the most dangerous element. The submarines were. China's Type 094 Jin-class ballistic missile submarines moved to patrol areas at maximum strike range from American bases in Guam and Japan. This was a nuclear signal, delivered in the language of posture rather than declaration. The message was explicit to anyone who reads military positioning. This operation is occurring under a nuclear umbrella that Beijing believes will impose caution on Washington's most aggressive response options. The conventional submarine force carried a different mission entirely. 12 Type 039A Yun-class attack submarines, China's most advanced non-nuclear boats, equipped with air-independent propulsion systems that allow silent submerged operation for weeks without surfacing, repositioned to blocking positions across the 4 primary strait corridors through which any reinforcement or resupply vessel would have to pass to reach Taiwan. These were not signals. They were weapons in position, waiting for authorization. And then the mines. In the hours before dawn, Type 022 Hobei-class missile boats operating from Fujian coast bases executed movements that American signals intelligence, which had been tracking abnormal traffic from those bases for 48 hours before the operation began, assessed as active mine-laying operations in the shallow water, northern and central sectors of the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan was not just surrounded, it was being sealed. I want you to stop for a moment and think about a specific number: 72 to 96 hours. That is the decision cycle window that China's military planners built this operation around. The window during which, based on 2 decades of studying American military behavior in crisis situations, PLA planning documents assessed that American political leadership would debate, consult allies, seek legal authorities, manage domestic opinion, and move through the deliberative process that has characterized every American military response since the end of the Cold War. Kosovo, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan. In every one of those situations, America deliberated before it acted. And the deliberation took time, days, sometimes weeks. Beijing studied that pattern, built planning assumptions around it, designed an operation that used the 72 to 96-hour window to consolidate a blockade before any American response force could reach effective intervention range. There was one problem with this model. The USS Ronald Reagan was already inside that range, not by accident, not by luck, not by coincidence, because the positioning of the Reagan Carrier Strike Group in the Philippine Sea, the specific positioning that placed it approximately 800 kilometers from Taiwan on the morning that China's operation began, was itself the product of a decade of strategic planning by American officers who had read the same intelligence assessments about PLA doctrine, studied the same academic analyses of Chinese military planning, and reached the conclusion that the single highest return deterrence investment the United States could make in the Taiwan Strait was persistent carrier presence in a position that collapsed China's decision window from 72 hours to something that China had not planned for. At 3:17 in the morning, the Reagan's watch officer received the first network picture showing the PLA Navy moving on every axis simultaneously. The commanding officer was on the bridge within 4 minutes. The air wing commander received his orders within 45 seconds of that conversation. The flight deck was turning. The Reagan's first combat air patrol was over the Taiwan Strait's eastern approaches at 6:40 in the morning. 3 hours and 40 minutes. Not 72 hours, not 96 hours. 3 hours and 40 minutes. China's decision cycle window had been designed around a number that the United States Navy had spent a decade making obsolete. The Reagan was the first layer. It was not the only layer. And the second and third layers are what the Eastern Theater Command's operational picture at the 6-hour mark showed had gone wrong. Layer 2, Guam. Within 4 hours of the PLA operation beginning, B-2 Spirit stealth bombers began generating sorties from Andersen Air Force Base. The B-2 is not designed for speed. It is designed for invisibility. Its radar cross-section is smaller than most birds. its emissions profile when operating with active emissions controls is close to undetectable by any radar system the PLA currently deploys at operational scale. The surface vessels executing China's blockade had sophisticated radar suites. Those radar suites would show them nothing until weapons were already on terminal approach. Layer 3, Okinawa. From Kadena Air Base, F-22 Raptors began forward deploying to positions inside the air combat geometry of the Taiwan Strait. The F-22's radar cross-section is approximately the size of a steel marble. The PLA's integrated air defense network, among the most sophisticated outside of Russia, would have profound difficulty building reliable tracks on F-22s flying at operational altitude with electronic emissions controlled. Layer 4, the water. The Virginia-class fast attack submarines that the US Pacific Fleet maintains on continuous patrol in the Western Pacific, whose locations are never confirmed and whose operations are never described publicly, began positioning adjustments that brought American attack boats into the same operating areas where China's Type 039A submarines were executing their blocking mission. Two submarine forces, same water, complete darkness, and the PLA Navy's anti-submarine warfare capability, its ability to find, track, and engage American submarines in deep water, is the weakest link in an otherwise increasingly capable military chain. American submarine doctrine is built specifically around exploiting that weakness, maintaining a presence that China cannot locate and therefore cannot plan around. China's blockade was surrounded by the force it was designed to surround. Layer 5, the alliance. Within 6 hours, Japan's self-defense forces reached their highest peacetime readiness level. Japan's post-war constitutional constraints have in practice meant that Japanese military planning stops at the water's edge of Japanese territory, but the Miyako Strait, the corridor the Shandong transited on its way to a blocking position northeast of Taiwan, is Japanese territorial waters. The activation of Japan's P-1 maritime patrol aircraft, its destroyer fleet, and its submarine force to a readiness posture consistent with monitoring and, if authorized, engaging threats in those waters was a signal that required no translation. Japan was not going to watch. The Philippines activated coastal surveillance assets in a pattern American planners assessed as cooperative. Australia began activating pre-positioned equipment frameworks negotiated specifically for this contingency. South Korea quietly adjusted its southern air defense sector. Seoul was managing exposure, not choosing Beijing. The alliance was not perfect. It was not unanimous. It had seams, but it was real. And it was moving faster than China's planning documents had projected. Here is what the Eastern Theater Command's operational assessment showed at the 6-hour mark. The American carrier was not 72 hours out. It was inside the operational envelope, with its air wing already generating sorties over Taiwan's eastern approaches. The B-2s from Guam could not be tracked by the surface vessels they were designed to strike. The American submarine force had not been located, which meant it was in the water somewhere, pointing at something, and the PLA Navy's surface ships were maneuvering without reliable knowledge of where the most lethal anti-ship weapons in the American inventory were targeted. Japan had activated rather than observed, creating a northern flank complication that planning had assessed as unlikely in the first 72 hours. The UN Security Council emergency session was already convening. The G7 statement was being drafted. The phone calls between American, Japanese, Australian, British, and European defense ministers had been running for 3 hours and were producing a political environment in which Beijing's ability to sustain the operation without escalating it was narrowing faster than its models had calculated. The Central Military Commission received this assessment at the 6-hour mark. And at the 8-hour mark, the operation was suspended. Not terminated, not reversed, suspended. The distinction matters because Beijing has invested enormous diplomatic and informational energy in maintaining it. Terminated means failed. Reversed means defeated. Suspended means paused. Paused means the option still exists. And the next time, the conditions might be more favorable. But suspended is suspended. The Shandong began withdrawing from its northeast blocking position at the 8-hour mark. The Fujian's southern movement reversed. The Type 039A submarines repositioned away from their straight corridor assignments. The mine-laying operation ceased. The electronic warfare output reduced. 8 hours after surrounding Taiwan, the People's Liberation Army Navy began the process of unsurrounding it. No shots fired, no weapons released, no vessel struck. But the gap between what the operations planning had promised the Central Military Commission and what the operational reality showed at the 6-hour mark was wide enough that continuing required accepting risks that the operation had not been authorized to accept. The risk of engagement with American submarines whose positions were unknown. The risk of a confrontation with Japanese self-defense forces operating in Japanese territorial waters. The risk that the B-2s from Guam were carrying weapons and would release them if the blockade's consolidation produced the kind of irreversible political threshold that converts military options into military necessities. These were not the risks the plan was built for. And somewhere in Beijing, in a room that will never be identified and with participants who will never be named, a decision was made that the plan needed to stop before the risks it had not modeled became the reality it could not manage. Go back to the beginning. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Taiwan was surrounded by the most sophisticated, coordinated military operation in the People's Liberation Army's history. By 11 o'clock in the morning, it was not surrounded anymore. What happened between those two moments is not a story about who won and who lost. No one won, no one lost. Not in the conventional sense that victory and defeat are assigned after a military engagement. What happened was a test. China tested its most advanced military planning, its carrier coordination doctrine, its submarine blocking capabilities, its multi-domain operational integration, against real conditions, in real time, against an adversary that was also operating in real time. And it found the gaps. The gap between modeled American response timelines and actual American response timelines, between projected Japanese behavior and actual Japanese behavior, between the blocking positions that submarines were assigned and the positions they could safely maintain without knowing where American attack submarines were, between the consolidated blockade that the 6-hour mark was supposed to show the Central Military Commission and the operational picture it actually showed. These are not abstract gaps. They are the specific distance between a plan that works in simulation and an operation that works in reality. The PLA now knows exactly where those gaps are, which means the PLA will spend the next years filling them. And America knows something too, something the 8-hour suspension tells it with a precision that years of intelligence collection could never provide. On this morning, in these 8 hours, China found the edge of what its military can currently do in the Taiwan Strait, and it stopped before crossing that edge. That edge is the most important intelligence data point the United States, Japan, Australia, and every Indo-Pacific stakeholder has collected in a decade. The lights on Taiwan's coastline are still burning. The next time will not be a test. The next time, the gaps will be smaller. The planning will have been revised, the training intensified, the equipment upgraded. The decision window that collapsed from 72 hours to 3 hours and 40 minutes will have been studied and planned around with a thoroughness that the PLA brings to every lesson it learns the hard way. The only question that determines what happens when that alarm goes off again at 3 o'clock in the morning is whether the alliance that proved it could respond in 8 hours is still unified, still positioned, and still willing to respond. Because the lights on Taiwan's coastline are only still burning because the answer to that question on this morning was yes. If that answer ever changes, the lights will go out, and nobody will be ready for what comes next. If this analysis showed you something about the Taiwan Strait that the headline coverage didn't, share it with someone who still thinks this is a theoretical scenario. Subscribe to the channel because we don't cover the operation. We cover what the operation reveals.